Welcome, dear listener, to the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where the autumn leaves drift lazily along cobblestone lanes and the scent of wood smoke mingles with the crisp morning air. Inside a small, well-kept cottage, Miss Marple sits by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly as she hums an old tune. The kettle whistles gently, and a tray of tea and biscuits waits nearby. But amid the comforting routine, whispers of something unusual stir through the village streets, a tale curious enough to catch even Miss Marple's keen attention. And so, dear listener, we begin with the curious tale of the widow who danced on her husband's grave. Chapter 1. Whispers and Shadows. The village of St. Mary Mead wore its autumn coat with quiet pride. Leaves of amber, gold, and russet tumbled along the narrow lanes, caught occasionally in the low branches of maples and oaks. The air held a crisp bite, hinting at winter's approach, yet carried the comforting aroma of burning logs from cottage chimneys. Early morning mist clung to the stone walls and hedgerows, softening the edges of the familiar houses and lending the village an almost enchanted quality. By the high street, shopkeepers were bustling behind frosted windows. Mrs. Pettigrew, the baker, arranged her morning display of apple tarts and cinnamon buns, while the grocer, Mr. Thorne, meticulously dusted the brass scales at his counter. Villagers greeted one another with nods and cheerful murmurs, exchanging news of small triumphs and petty misadventures, yet the usual calm was tinged with curiosity. Something, it seemed, had unsettled the air. Miss Marple, strolling along the lane in her tweed coat and sensible hat, paused to observe a gathering of children kicking leaves in the square. She smiled faintly, her sharp eyes noting the subtle changes in demeanour among the adults, the quick, whispered exchanges that might escape a stranger's notice. Even in St. Mary Mead, the most familiar village in all England, life had its undercurrents of mystery, and Miss Marple's instincts were never wrong. Across the village green, preparations for the harvest festival were underway. Stalls were being erected, adorned with bales of hay and garlands of autumn flowers. The scent of spiced cider drifted from the tent near the church, mingling with the earthy smell of damp leaves. The vicar's wife, bustling about with a clipboard in hand, offered instructions to a group of young helpers, her voice both kind and commanding. Villagers paused to gossip, noting who had arrived early, who was missing, and who had been seen speaking to whom in hushed tones. As Miss Marple continued her leisurely walk, her attention was drawn to the edge of the churchyard. The ancient yew trees cast long shadows across the worn gravestones, and a faint rustle suggested movement among the leaves. It was nothing remarkable, yet the way a solitary figure had disappeared behind the tombs pricked at her curiosity. Perhaps it was the wind, or perhaps it was something, or someone, less easily explained. The village, in its serene autumn beauty, seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that ordinary days could swiftly turn peculiar. Miss Marple's knitting needles, if they were in her hands, would have itched to click just a little faster. And so, with the last glance at the cobbled street and the distant church tower, the scene was set for a tale that would stir both whispers and wonder in the hearts of St. Mary Mead. The widow, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, had returned to St. Mary Mead not long after her husband's funeral, yet already the village seemed to hum with whispers about her. She was a small woman, not ungraceful, with a quick smile that seemed almost too bright for the shadow that hung around her. Her black dress, though tasteful, did little to conceal the restlessness that lingered in her movements. Some villagers said she carried herself with newfound freedom. Others insisted there was something unnerving in the way she seemed to glide across the cobblestones as if she belonged to another world entirely. Clara's unusual behaviour first drew attention on All Hallows' Eve, when the wind had whipped leaves into dancing spirals along the churchyard paths. That evening, she had been seen by a few daring souls, standing by her late husband's grave, turning and twirling as though the earth itself had whispered her permission. The sight was brief, just long enough for imagination to seize hold. Mrs. McClure, who tended the vicarage garden, swore she had never seen such audacity, while Mr. Thorne, the grocer, insisted there had to be some explanation rooted in propriety, however obscure. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by her window as she observed the late afternoon sun filtering through the golden leaves, had caught a glimpse herself. She did not gasp, nor did she frown, but her mind quietly catalogued the details. The widow's skirts brushing against the dewy grass, the faint glimmer of a locket at her throat, the way her eyes darted as though seeking an audience who was not there. In St. Mary Mead, people often thought the unusual behaviour of others was a sign of scandal or folly, but Miss Marple had long learned that it could equally conceal fear, grief, or even cunning. As Clara walked the lanes of the village, the townsfolk observed her from shop windows and gate-posts. She paused occasionally, nodding to acquaintances with a polite smile that never lingered. Conversations arose in hushed tones. "Do you think she's gone mad with grief?" asked one. "Or perhaps there's a story we are not meant to hear," replied another. And though many whispered judgments, Miss Marple noted the subtler signs, the quick glances over the shoulder, the tightened clasp of a handbag, the careful avoidance of certain houses and alleyways. All these were breadcrumbs in a puzzle waiting to be solved. By late afternoon, Clara had made her way to the small square near the church. There, a few curious villagers lingered under the fading light, hoping for a hint of explanation. The widow stopped briefly by the fountain, her reflection in the water flickering with the movement of the leaves above. Even at this distance, her dance, whether literal or imagined by onlookers, seemed to challenge the village itself, a quiet declaration that life, or at least her life, had shifted irrevocably. Miss Marple, settling into her chair as the kettle began to sing, allowed herself a small smile. There was more to Clara Henshaw than met the eye, and in the careful unfolding of village life, the story of the widow who danced on her husband's grave was only beginning. Chapter 2. Secrets in Plain Sight. The vicarage was a picture of cosy civility, as it often was on mid-morning weekdays. The windows, polished to catch the soft autumn light, framed views of the amber-tinted village lanes. Inside, the faint scent of fresh scones mingled with the comforting aroma of chamomile tea. Miss Marple, comfortably seated in her favourite high-backed chair, had her knitting balanced neatly on her lap. Around the low oak table, the vicar's wife and two visiting ladies fussed gently with silver spoons and delicate teacups, their chatter flowing like a warm stream across the quiet room. "Did you see her in the churchyard again?" Mrs. Cartwright whispered, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Dancing, I tell you. Right there on the grave." She clutched her shawl, as if the very act could send a chill through the room. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. She stirred her tea with delicate care, listening more than she spoke. The lady's fascination was understandable. Clara Henshaw's behaviour had become the talk of the village. Yet Miss Marple noticed the nuances the others missed, the soft tension in Mrs. Cartwright's posture, the hesitation of her words, the way her eyes flicked toward the window, as if imagining the widow's movements outside. Mrs. Thorne, the grocer's wife, leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "I heard from Mrs. Pettigrew that Mr. Henshaw was not always the kindest of husbands. Perhaps she celebrates, rather than mourns." There was a slight shiver in her tone, a mixture of speculation and the thrill of rumour. Miss Marple sipped her tea, allowing the warm liquid to soothe the quiet unease that seemed to linger like a shadow in the room. She knew that beneath every scandalous whisper lay a story far more layered than the village gossip suggested. Sometimes, she thought, people use performance, be it grief, joy, or rebellion, to conceal truths they dare not speak aloud. The conversation drifted toward other matters: the upcoming harvest festival, the children's costumes, the new fence along the vicarage garden, but always returned to the widow. Each remark carried subtle judgments, assumptions, and a tinge of curiosity. Miss Marple, however, kept her observations quietly catalogued. The twitch of an eyebrow here, a quick glance there, the way the vicar's wife's hand lingered on a letter before hastily setting it aside. Every fragment might someday form a piece of a larger puzzle. A soft knock at the door drew their attention. The postman, looking somewhat uneasy, presented a letter with black sealing wax addressed to Clara Henshaw. The room went still, the simmering gossip pausing as the envelope changed everything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "This," she murmured, almost to herself, "may explain her dances." The others leaned closer, curiosity sparkling in their eyes. Yet even as the envelope lay unopened, a sense of quiet anticipation hung over the tea-laden table. Secrets had a way of finding their audience in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple suspected that this letter was merely the beginning. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the leaves, whispering promises of revelations, small triumphs, and perhaps a shadowed scandal that would ripple through the village streets. Miss Marple, ever watchful, placed her cup down with delicate precision, ready for the story that was quietly unfolding around her. By the following morning, the tale of Mrs. Clara Henshaw's nocturnal dance had spread like wildfire through the lanes and cottages of St. Mary Mead. It began with hushed whispers in the bakery, grew louder in the grocer's shop, and had reached nearly every doorstep before breakfast was even served. Villagers paused mid-step to exchange glances, their voices low yet urgent, as if they feared being overheard by the very subject of their gossip. Miss Marple, walking past the familiar faces on her morning stroll, noted each reaction carefully: the faint lift of an eyebrow, the quick avoidance of her gaze, the twitch of lips attempting to suppress a smile. Mrs. Pettigrew, flower-dusted and excitable, had already recounted the story several times to anyone who would listen. "I swear on my bread tray," she insisted to a cluster of eager listeners, "she was twirling about the gravestone, as if celebrating rather than mourning." Her voice carried the thrill of scandal, and the ladies around her leaned closer, eager for every detail, embellishing what they had seen with fragments of imagination. Meanwhile, Mr. Thorne polished his brass scales behind the counter, muttering about propriety and the unusual ways grief could manifest. "It's all very irregular, I say," he confided to a regular customer, though his eyes, sharper than most gave him credit for, followed Miss Marple passing by the window. She observed the glances and the hushed exchanges as she moved on, a quiet smile playing on her lips. In St. Mary Mead, she thought, people often revealed far more about themselves in gossip than the subject ever could. Even the children seemed to sense the curiosity surrounding the widow. They whispered among themselves on the green, daring one another to peek through the iron gates of the churchyard, imagining ghostly figures dancing in the mist. Their laughter, half playful, half nervous, drifted on the wind, adding an eerie undertone to the otherwise serene autumn day. Miss Marple paused to watch them, her mind noting patterns and inconsistencies. Children, after all, were sometimes more observant than the adults who scolded them. By mid-morning, the village square had become a stage for speculation. Opinions clashed as quickly as the leaves fell. Some insisted Clara was simply expressing relief at newfound freedom, others whispered of hidden lovers, secret quarrels, or even revenge on the late Mr. Henshaw. Every passerby seemed to carry a piece of the story, yet no one possessed the full truth. And as the village council met in hurried whispers, Miss Marple observed silently from the edge of the square, her keen mind assembling fragments of information into threads that might one day form a coherent picture. That afternoon, a solitary figure was seen hurrying from the churchyard to the main street, pausing occasionally to glance behind. Though distant, it was enough to excite the villagers, who quickly speculated on identity and intent. Miss Marple, of course, took note, but remained composed. In a village as small and observant as St. Mary Mead, a single movement could speak volumes, if one only knew how to listen. And so the rumour grew, weaving itself into the daily rhythms of the village, a quiet undercurrent beneath the ordinary routines of life. Even Miss Marple felt a flicker of anticipation. It was the subtle disturbances, after all, that often heralded the most curious mysteries. One might think this was merely gossip, but in St. Mary Mead, gossip was often the first step toward the truth. Chapter 3: Midnight Movements. It was just after lunch when a stranger arrived in St. Mary Mead, a figure unfamiliar to even the most vigilant eyes of the villagers. The man was tall and impeccably dressed in city attire, dark overcoat, polished boots, and a neatly pressed scarf tucked under his collar. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to attention, yet he moved deliberately, as if wary of drawing any more than necessary. Whispers began almost immediately. Who was he, and why had he come to this quiet village now, of all times? Miss Marple noticed him first from her habitual perch on the vicarage bench, her knitting needles paused mid-click. The stranger's eyes, sharp and calculating, lingered on the cottages along the high street as though he were scanning for a particular face. Villagers stopped in their tracks, some daring to murmur greetings, others retreating behind doors and curtains. Even Mrs. Pettigrew, ever curious, seemed momentarily lost for words as he passed her bakery. At the village square, the stranger paused, glancing around before approaching a modest house at the far end of the lane. His gaze was measured, almost impatient, and his fingers adjusted the cuff of his coat as he surveyed the surroundings. A few residents dared to speculate aloud. "Perhaps he's a solicitor," whispered one. "Or a relative of the widow's," another ventured. Miss Marple, however, noticed subtle clues the others missed: the faint scuff of mud along the hem of his coat, the way he avoided the sunlight hitting the front windows, and a small crease on his gloves that suggested hurried travel. The widow herself, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, had retreated to the shade of her doorway, her eyes wary yet composed. She watched the stranger, tilting her head slightly, as though assessing his intentions before he even spoke. The few villagers brave enough to peek from behind hedges noted her calm, though their imaginations quickly supplied a dozen possible narratives: blackmail, lost inheritance, secret correspondence. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the square, simply observed, her mind cataloguing each detail with measured patience. As the stranger moved on, pausing at the edge of the churchyard for a moment that seemed longer than necessary, Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. There was something familiar in the way he handled himself, though she could not immediately place it. Yet the most intriguing aspect was the faint trail of soil clinging to his boots, fresh earth, unmistakably from the graves themselves. This subtle hint, invisible to most, suggested a purpose far removed from casual visits or polite inquiry. By late afternoon, the stranger had disappeared into the winding lanes, leaving behind an air of unease and speculation. Villagers murmured about his presence as they resumed their routines, but the threads of curiosity remained, woven tightly around the widow and her mysterious behaviour. Miss Marple rose from her seat, adjusting her hat with quiet precision. The game, as she silently noted, was afoot, and she intended to observe carefully, for even the smallest clue in St. Mary Mead could unravel secrets hidden for years. By late afternoon, a gentle breeze rustled the amber leaves along the lanes of St. Mary Mead, carrying with it the distant chiming of the church bells. The village seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating yet another twist in the story that had captivated every curious eye and wagging tongue. Miss Marple, strolling at her usual unhurried pace, noted the tension that clung to the air. She had already observed the stranger, his brief visit leaving more questions than answers. Now, the attention shifted back to the widow herself. Mrs. Clara Henshaw had returned to her cottage after an errand to the grocer, her expression composed yet guarded. The vicar, a man of gentle voice and measured patience, appeared at her doorstep with the quiet authority of one who understood both propriety and human frailty. "Mrs. Henshaw," he began softly, "the villagers are concerned about your behavior near your husband's grave. Perhaps you could tell me what has prompted such unusual actions." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She lowered her eyes, fingering the clasp of her handbag, then looked up with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. "Vicar, I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice steady yet tinged with unease, "but some things are best kept to oneself. The heart carries burdens the world need not know." The vicar's brow furrowed, though there was no trace of judgment in his gaze, only a quiet understanding, the kind of patience reserved for those who grieve. Miss Marple, observing from the garden gate, noted the subtle details. The way Clara shifted her weight, the glimmer of moisture at the corners of her eyes, the careful modulation of her tone to mask tremors of fear or defiance. Every gesture, every pause, spoke more than words ever could. "Yet the villagers are curious," the vicar continued gently, "and their curiosity has a way of growing into worry. Perhaps you would allow a friend, or someone like me, to understand? It might ease both your burden and theirs." Clara shook her head slightly, a shadow of a smile crossing her lips, delicate and fleeting. "I fear that if I tell, it will only fan the flames of gossip, vicar. And some truths," she added, her voice dropping just enough to catch Miss Marple's attention, "are dangerous when spoken aloud." Miss Marple's mind quietly catalogued these words. There was more to Clara's story than sorrow or whimsy. There was calculation, perhaps necessity, and certainly caution. She noticed a faint tremor in Clara's hands, a sign that the widow carried more than grief, perhaps fear, or secret she could not yet reveal. As Clara turned to retreat inside her cottage, a sudden movement at the edge of the garden caught the vicar's eye, a flicker of shadow, a lantern swaying slightly as though someone unseen, was observing from the churchyard. The air grew chillier, and even the vicar felt the shift in atmosphere, the subtle warning that the ordinary world of St. Mary Mead had been touched by something stranger, something unseen. Miss Marple's lips curved into a knowing smile, a small spark of anticipation lighting her otherwise calm expression. For every secret hinted at, for every whispered fear, there was a trail of clues waiting to be followed. And in St. Mary Mead, the quietest observations often revealed the most startling truths. The night had settled over St. Mary Mead with a velvet hush, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the cobblestones. The churchyard lay shrouded in mist, its gravestones casting long, eerie shadows under the silvery glow of the moon. Miss Marple, wrapped in her tweed coat and clutching a small lantern, moved quietly along the familiar paths, her sharp eyes sweeping every corner for signs that most would overlook. Something was amiss, she felt, and the instinct that had guided her through many curious cases stirred with gentle insistence. Earlier that evening, the sexton had reported a disturbance near Mr. Henshaw's grave, a subtle shift in the soil, a faint trace of footprints that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The villagers, while superstitious and prone to exaggeration, had been convinced that something untoward had occurred. Miss Marple, who preferred to investigate quietly before alarms grew, decided a careful night watch was warranted. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic, a reminder of the life and the secrets buried beneath the headstones. As she approached the edge of the graveyard, Miss Marple noticed a lantern swinging gently in the distance. Someone was moving between the graves, careful yet purposeful, leaving behind an almost imperceptible trail of disturbed leaves. She slowed her steps, her heart steady, and observed without drawing attention. The figure paused at the base of a particularly aged tombstone, its inscriptions nearly worn away by time. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The posture, the hesitation, the careful hands, they all suggested more than mischief or idle wandering. She stepped lightly to get a closer view, mindful of the gravel path crunching softly underfoot. There, half hidden in the grass, lay a small glint, a gold cuff-link catching the lantern light. Miss Marple stooped, lifting it delicately with a handkerchief to avoid leaving fingerprints, and examined it closely. A subtle engraving suggested it had belonged to someone of refinement, likely not a villager at all. The significance was immediate. Here was a clue, placed or lost intentionally, pointing towards secrets that had yet to surface in conversation or gossip. A distant hoot made her glance toward the church tower, and in that instant a shadow flitted across the far edge of the graveyard. Miss Marple remained still, breathing softly, letting the night embrace her as she observed. Whoever had moved so carefully among the graves had noticed her presence, yet continued undeterred, suggesting confidence, knowledge, or perhaps desperation. By the time she returned to the main path, the first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon with pale light. The village still slumbered, unaware of the delicate threads being woven in the churchyard. Miss Marple tucked the cuff-link into her pocket, her mind already tracing connections, possibilities, and motives. In St. Mary Mead, as she knew well, even the quietest nights could hold the loudest secrets, and the small, seemingly innocuous details often proved to be the most revealing. Chapter 4. Threads of the Puzzle. By mid-morning, the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead was interrupted by the arrival of a new official presence, Inspector Craddock, whose polished boots clicked steadily along the cobblestones. He carried the air of authority that demanded attention, yet there was a kindly patience in his eyes, a recognition that village matters required diplomacy as much as investigation. The news of the widow's peculiar behavior and the recent disturbances at the churchyard had prompted his visit, and already villagers gathered discreetly along the lanes, craning necks to catch a glimpse of the man tasked with uncovering the truth. Miss Marple, seated in her usual garden chair with her knitting bag resting beside her, observed the inspector's approach with mild amusement and keen interest. She had long known that official investigations often overlooked the subtleties that the quietest observers could discern. Craddock approached Clara Henshaw's cottage first, papers in hand, a polite yet firm tone carrying over the cobblestones. "Mrs. Henshaw," he began, tipping his hat slightly, "I understand there have been unusual occurrences at your late husband's grave. I must ask a few questions to ensure nothing untoward has taken place." His words were measured, but the weight behind them left no room for evasion. Clara's expression remained composed, though her fingers fidgeted with the clasp of her handbag. Miss Marple noted every detail, the slight stiffening of Clara's posture, the quick blink of hesitation before answering, the deliberate way she avoided meeting the inspector's gaze for more than a fleeting moment. There was nothing overtly alarming, yet something beneath the surface hinted at deeper truths. The stranger who had visited the village only yesterday lingered in her mind, his brief presence threading uneasily with the unfolding events. As the inspector moved on to speak with witnesses, villagers shared their accounts with varying degrees of embellishment. Mrs. Pettigrew, ever eager, insisted she had seen shadows flitting among the gravestones, while Mr. Thorne claimed the widow had danced as if mocking the late Mr. Henshaw. Craddock listened politely, jotting notes, yet Miss Marple could see the subtle scepticism in his eyes. He weighed every story, every whisper, while quietly noting contradictions. A sudden movement at the churchyard edge drew attention. A figure, fleeting and shadowy, disappeared among the tombstones. The inspector's brow furrowed. He suspected nothing casual could explain it. Miss Marple, observing from her vantage point, already connected the faint trail of disturbed soil with the cufflink she had discovered earlier. The pieces were small, delicate, yet pointed unmistakably toward someone with purpose. By late afternoon, Craddock had gathered enough testimony to know that the situation was more layered than simple village gossip. He returned to Clara's cottage to clarify a few details, while Miss Marple, quietly resuming her knitting, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. In St. Mary Mead, the official and the observant often pursued the same truth by very different paths, and sometimes it was the quiet, patient eye that revealed the heart of the matter. The village, meanwhile, hummed with speculation, but the real story remained veiled, waiting for Miss Marple's careful attention to unravel its secrets. The library at the vicarage was a sanctuary of quiet warmth, its tall oak shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that carried the weight of centuries. Miss Marple had spent many afternoons here, poring over parish records and old newspapers, finding that the village's past often held the keys to its present curiosities. On this particular day, she sought answers not in gossip or fleeting observations, but in the carefully preserved documents that whispered of lives long gone, secrets tucked neatly between the pages. Miss Marple's fingers traced the spines of books, pausing on the familiar volumes that chronicled marriages, deaths, and wills. Her eyes, sharp beneath her small spectacles, caught on a set of handwritten notes detailing the Henshaw family lineage. Mr. Henshaw had been a man of some means, and yet there were discrepancies in the estate records, small gaps in dates and transactions that suggested matters not entirely above board. The widow's dance on his grave, she now considered, might not be mere grief or mere audacity, but a silent acknowledgment of buried disputes, debts, or secrets left unresolved. The vicar, standing nearby, watched the gentle flurry of paper and ink with mild curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "it's remarkable how much of the past can speak when one knows how to listen. Some villagers would dismiss such records as dry and uninteresting." "Ah," she replied, her voice measured, "but the past rarely lies. It only waits patiently for the right eyes to notice what others overlook." Among the documents, Miss Marple discovered references to a mysterious will, filed decades ago and never fully executed. The witnesses to this will were long deceased, and yet the careful notation suggested that certain provisions had been deliberately obscured. She made notes in her small leather notebook, cross-referencing names, dates, and unusual transactions that might explain Clara Henshaw's secretive behavior. A sudden knock at the library door caused her to glance up. It was Mrs. Cartwright, bearing a basket of freshly baked scones, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," she said, "but I thought perhaps you'd like a little refreshment while you work. And, well, I heard the latest whispers about the widow. Surely there's something more to it than mere dancing." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "Thank you, my dear. You never know when a warm scone might help one think more clearly. And as for Mrs. Henshaw, yes, there is more than meets the eye. I believe the past, hidden in plain sight, has begun to reveal a few secrets." The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes in the quiet air. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the papers, her mind piecing together fragments of history, behavior, and subtle clues. Every ledger entry, every faint signature could form part of a puzzle that the casual eye would overlook. And as the shadows lengthened, curling across the library floor like whispered warnings, she felt the gentle thrill of discovery. The widow's story, tangled with the past and present of St. Mary Mead, was slowly unravelling, and Miss Marple's patient watchfulness promised that the truth, however curious, unsettling, or unexpected, would eventually be known. The next morning, a crisp wind swept through St. Mary Mead, rattling the shutters of cottages and scattering leaves along the cobbled streets. Miss Marple had just finished her early tea when a knock at her door announced the arrival of the postman, his expression unusually grave. In his hand was a small envelope, heavy with the weight of expectation, sealed with black wax and addressed in a delicate, unfamiliar hand, Mrs. Clara Henshaw. Miss Marple carefully took the letter, noting the meticulous script and the faint perfume that lingered in the paper, a touch of elegance, perhaps intended to intrigue or unsettle. She did not open it herself. Instead, she placed it on the table in the vicarage, knowing that Mrs. Henshaw would likely arrive soon to collect it. Miss Marple had learned long ago that patience often revealed far more than haste. It was not long before the widow appeared, her dark dress contrasting sharply with the pale autumn sunlight, and her expression measured, yet faintly tense. She paused as Miss Marple offered her the envelope. "This arrived for you this morning," she said gently. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, her eyes flicking to the black wax seal with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Who could have sent this?" she murmured, half to herself, half to Miss Marple. The widow's voice, though calm, carried the faintest tremor, betraying her otherwise composed exterior. Miss Marple, observing closely, noted the way Clara's fingers lingered on the seal, the hesitation before she finally broke it, and the careful unfolding of the letter inside. The words within were concise but heavy with implication. They referred to family matters long thought resolved, to debts and disputes buried in the past, and to certain actions required by Clara alone, actions that, if ignored, might unravel reputations or disrupt carefully laid plans. The tone was polite, yet the undercurrent of urgency was unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes, hidden behind the rim of her spectacles, narrowed ever so slightly. She could already see how this letter might have influenced the widow's recent behavior, including the infamous dance at the grave. Clara read the letter aloud softly, as if testing the weight of the words. "It seems," she said finally, her lips pressing into a thin line, "that the past is not quite done with me, Miss Marple. Some matters must be settled, whether I am ready or not." Her gaze drifted toward the churchyard, as if the very gravestones could offer counsel or solace. Miss Marple, knitting quietly beside her, considered the implications. A secret letter, carefully delivered, could explain much of the widow's recent oddities, the dances, the furtive glances, the hesitation in her voice. Yet it also hinted at something larger, a network of hidden agreements and long-standing mysteries that would not reveal themselves easily. By the time Clara folded the letter and tucked it safely into her bag, the autumn light had shifted, casting the village in gentle shadows. The sense of anticipation was palpable. Even the ordinary birdsong seemed to carry a note of suspense. Miss Marple, as always, remained quietly observant, knowing that the unfolding of these secrets would require patience, wit, and a careful eye for the smallest of clues. And she intended to follow every one. The following afternoon, Miss Marple found herself once more at the edge of the churchyard, the low autumn sun casting elongated shadows across the worn gravestones. The air carried a faint chill, and the rustling of leaves seemed to whisper secrets as they danced along the stone paths. There was an almost imperceptible tension in the quiet village, one that even the most oblivious townsfolk could sense if they paused long enough. Miss Marple, of course, noticed far more than most. Earlier that morning, a young villager had reported an unusual sight. Several gravestones had been disturbed, their bases scuffed as though someone had been kneeling or kneading at the soil. Miss Marple had walked the paths herself, taking in the subtle clues, the faint indentation of footprints, a small scrap of black fabric snagged on a jagged stone, and the odd tilt of the Henshaw family tombstone. These were not accidents of weather or neglect. Someone had been here, carefully, deliberately. The widow herself had been seen lingering near the edge of the churchyard once more, glancing over her shoulder with nervous alertness. Whether she was aware of the disturbances, or merely responding to an instinct she did not fully understand, was unclear. Miss Marple observed her from a discreet distance, noting the tension in her shoulders, the rapid flicker of her eyes, and the careful way she avoided stepping on the fallen leaves that might betray her presence. Miss Marple moved closer to inspect the Henshaw grave. The soil was freshly turned in subtle patches, revealing something beneath the surface. She crouched carefully, brushing away leaves and dirt, and discovered a small metal box, partially concealed and damp from the morning dew. It appeared old, though not ancient, and its clasp was intricately designed, as though intended to be noticed only by a careful observer. She set it aside, making a mental note to examine it later under proper lighting, for this discovery was almost certainly connected to the widow's recent actions. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sounds of the village, the distant clatter of shutters, the soft tolling of the church bells, and the occasional caw of a crow perched upon a gnarled yew. Even in this serene village, the world seemed ready to reveal its secrets in unexpected ways. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each detail, from the minor disturbances of soil to the subtle signs of someone, or perhaps more than one person, interacting with the graves. As she straightened, a shadow passed over the gravestones, catching the corner of her eye. A fleeting movement, almost imperceptible, suggested another observer or participant in the nocturnal activity. The churchyard, in its quiet beauty, had become a stage for a story that was far from ordinary. Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. In St. Mary Mead, even the calmest places could conceal intrigue, and tonight, as she tucked the small box carefully into her coat pocket, she felt the first threads of a puzzle begin to weave together. The village, serene in appearance, was never quite as tranquil as it seemed. And the mystery of the widow who danced on her husband's grave was just beginning to unfold. The small cottage at the edge of St. Mary Mead had always been tidy, the kind of home that reflected both order and comfort. Lace curtains framed the windows, and the scent of freshly baked bread lingered faintly in the air. Yet today, Miss Marple noticed subtle signs that all was not as it seemed. A chair slightly askew, a faint smudge on the windowsill, and the careful stacking of papers suggested both haste and deliberate concealment. The widow, Mrs. Clara Henshaw, moved through her home with a practised composure, but the small details betrayed tension, perhaps even secrecy. Miss Marple entered quietly, nodding politely to Clara, who acknowledged her with a faint, reserved smile. "I hope I am not intruding," Miss Marple said softly, setting down her knitting bag. Clara shook her head, gestures measured, yet the eyes, alert, watchful, and slightly anxious, revealed she had anticipated this visit. As they settled near the fire, Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the room. Books were arranged by height, and teacups rested delicately on saucers, yet a folded piece of parchment peeked from beneath a stack of letters on the small oak table. Carefully, Miss Marple reached for it, noting the faint traces of wax on the edge, similar to that sealing the letter from the previous morning. The paper carried handwriting that was deliberate, practiced, yet hurried, as if written under pressure or secrecy. Clara's hands twitched as Miss Marple examined the parchment. "I suppose that is something you should see," she murmured, her voice calm but restrained. The document contained references to family property, unsettled accounts, and a series of instructions that suggested planning rather than chaos. Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately catalogued the possibilities: hidden debts, potential claimants, or perhaps someone leveraging fear to ensure compliance. The small cottage, warm and inviting as it appeared, seemed suddenly to carry the tension of secrets waiting to be revealed. Miss Marple noticed a faint indentation on the wooden floor beneath the papers, as if something had recently been lifted or hidden. The fireplace flickered, casting shadows that danced along the walls, and the widow's gaze flitted toward it as though aware of every nuance in the room. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said gently, "how the quietest places can conceal the most telling clues." Clara nodded, folding her hands tightly in her lap, her composure masking a tension that Miss Marple, of course, could not miss. As the afternoon sunlight waned, Miss Marple tucked the parchment carefully into her notebook, making note of every detail: the handwriting, the faint wax, the positioning of objects, all clues that could illuminate the mystery surrounding the widow's recent behavior. There was a method behind the apparent disorder, a subtle orchestration that spoke of intention rather than chance. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Clara's voice stopped her. "Some things," she said softly, "are better left undisturbed." Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. In St. Mary Mead, curiosity was seldom punished, and the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, always found a way to surface. And tonight, with the village cloaked in twilight, the first pieces of the puzzle had begun to settle into place. The churchyard lay in a hush deeper than any Miss Marple had felt before. Midnight had claimed the village, and the autumn wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the yew trees, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The moon, thin and pale, cast silvery beams across the gravestones, turning them into ghostly sentinels watching over secrets too long buried. Miss Marple's lantern flickered gently in the darkness as she moved with deliberate care, her eyes sharp and alert for the subtle signs that most would miss. Earlier in the evening, Clara Henshaw had vanished briefly from her cottage, leaving behind a faint trace of movement that suggested both urgency and apprehension. Miss Marple, anticipating such an action, had chosen to remain near the churchyard edge, cloaked in shadow and patience. She had learned over the years that those who moved under the cover of night often left truths exposed in the smallest of details: a misplaced shoe, a disturbance in the grass, or the faint glimmer of metal against stone. As she approached the Henshaw grave, a soft crunching sound caught her attention. Miss Marple paused, listening. There was movement among the tombstones, careful and deliberate, as though someone was searching for something, or perhaps leaving something behind. The widow appeared then, her silhouette framed by the ghostly moonlight, a lantern in one hand and a small, wrapped parcel in the other. She moved with a rhythm that seemed almost ritualistic, a careful dance that echoed the rumours circulating through the village, yet now bore a purpose far beyond mere spectacle. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting each deliberate motion. The parcel was set upon the freshly turned soil, and the widow paused, her eyes sweeping the churchyard as if ensuring no one watched too closely. Then, with careful hands, she unearthed a small metal box from beneath the earth. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as the same she had found earlier, now returned to its intended custodian. The careful symmetry of actions, the precision of gestures, all suggested knowledge and intent rather than accident. Clara's hand shook ever so slightly as she examined the box, and Miss Marple noted the faint glint of a key she retrieved from her pocket. The box was unlocked, revealing papers and small objects, tokens of a past hidden, instructions and accounts long overlooked, and perhaps the reason for the widow's dance and mysterious behavior. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, each movement in the churchyard an elegant punctuation to the story that had fascinated the village. A sudden hoot of an owl echoed through the trees, and Miss Marple's lantern flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air held a tension that was both eerie and illuminating, a quiet revelation unfolding beneath the moonlight. Miss Marple's mind catalogued every detail, the timing, the placement, the rhythm, knowing that the night had revealed far more than words or gossip ever could. As Clara returned the box to the earth, covering it with care, Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, a small smile of satisfaction crossing her face. In St. Mary Mead, the quietest nights often held the most telling truths, and tonight the widow's secrets had begun to surface in ways both subtle and profound. Chapter 5. Resolution and Reflection. The serenity of St. Mary Mead was shattered in the late morning by the sharp clamour of the church bells, an unusual sound for a weekday. Villagers hurried into the streets, curiosity and concern mingling in every whispered conversation. Something had occurred, though what, no one yet knew, and the news travelled faster than the autumn wind. Miss Marple, perched near the vicarage gate with her knitting bag at her side, rose calmly, her keen eyes taking in the stirring crowd. Even in apparent chaos, she knew, the smallest details revealed far more than the loudest rumours. Mrs. Pettigrew was the first to reach the square, her flower-dusted hands trembling as she recounted a startling discovery. It's dreadful," she exclaimed. "Some of the gravestones, they've been overturned. And footprints all over the churchyard. I never thought I'd see such things here." Her voice carried panic, yet the keen observer in Miss Marple noted the faint excitement dancing beneath her worry. To some villagers, the disturbance was terrifying. To others, it was a curiosity impossible to resist. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly thereafter, his presence commanding calm. He moved methodically, questioning the villagers while examining the disturbed stones. Miss Marple observed from a discreet distance, noting the inspector's reactions, subtle gestures, the tilt of his head, the way he noted which stones were affected and which remained undisturbed. Even amid disorder, the logical mind could discern patterns. Clara Henshaw appeared at the edge of the crowd, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes revealing the slightest flicker of apprehension. Miss Marple saw the tension in the widow's shoulders and the way she hesitated before stepping forward, as though measuring the risk of drawing attention. The villagers, quick to gossip, murmured and speculated, their voices carrying rumours and conjectures like autumn leaves swirling in the wind. Some wondered if Clara had returned to the churchyard under cover of darkness, while others suspected a visitor, perhaps the stranger who had recently appeared in the village. Miss Marple moved closer, her mind cataloguing details. The footprints in the soil were varied, some deep, some light, and they formed patterns that hinted at deliberate searching rather than casual wandering. There were also subtle marks near the Henshaw tombstone that suggested the careful movement of a small object, likely the metal box Miss Marple had previously discovered. The widow's recent nocturnal excursions suddenly seemed less eccentric and more purposeful, a carefully orchestrated effort to conceal or retrieve something of significance. As the villagers speculated and the inspector recorded observations, a sudden gust of wind sent a shower of leaves tumbling across the square, briefly obscuring a shadowy figure slipping quietly into an alley. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement, noting the way it vanished from sight with deliberate precision. Whoever it was, they had knowledge of the churchyard and the disturbed stones, and perhaps, Miss Marple thought with quiet satisfaction, they would soon reveal more than even the most curious villagers could imagine. The tension in St. Mary Mead lingered long after the bells fell silent, a gentle hum of speculation and concern. Miss Marple, knitting needles paused in hand, allowed herself a quiet smile. In this village, alarms often signaled the beginning of discovery rather than mere panic, and she intended to see every secret unveiled, no matter how delicately hidden. The early evening light bathed St. Mary Mead in soft gold, casting long shadows across the village lanes. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite garden chair, knitting forgotten for the moment as her mind worked with methodical precision. The events of recent days, the widow's strange dances, the mysterious stranger, the discoveries at the churchyard, and the secret letter were no longer isolated incidents. Each was a thread, and she was beginning to see the pattern that connected them. The metal box, carefully examined by Miss Marple that morning, contained more than just papers. It was a repository of intentions and obligations. Old family agreements, letters detailing unsettled debts, and annotations regarding inheritance formed a coherent story when read in sequence. She realized that Clara Henshaw's midnight excursions, her careful dances at the grave, and the nervous glances she exchanged in the village were all part of an intricate choreography designed to manage the past discreetly. Miss Marple's eyes travelled to the widow herself, sitting quietly by the window, the fading sun casting a warm glow on her dark attire. Clara's hands, previously so restless, now folded neatly in her lap, suggested a subtle understanding of her own precarious situation. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the motives hidden behind the outward displays: fear, caution, perhaps even defiance, but guided by knowledge and necessity rather than madness. The stranger's brief presence the previous week also began to take on new significance. His careful observation of the village and, in particular, the Henshaw household suggested that he, too, was aware of these hidden histories. Perhaps he sought information, or perhaps he acted as an agent ensuring that secrets remained properly managed. Miss Marple considered the footprints and disturbed stones in the churchyard. Now, there were not signs of recklessness but deliberate movement, each step calculated to protect or retrieve the evidence contained in the metal box. Even the village gossip, which at first seemed an amusing distraction, now provided valuable clues. The timing of reports, the embellishments offered by various villagers, and the way certain individuals exaggerated details revealed patterns of perception and misinformation. Miss Marple noted which stories were consistent and which carried inconsistencies. In these small discrepancies lay the truth, subtle and concealed, waiting for patient observation. By twilight, the pieces of the puzzle were forming a clear picture. The widow's behavior, though initially alarming to the village, was entirely purposeful. It was a delicate dance of secrecy, of protection, and of navigating the treacherous waters of inherited obligations. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The threads were connecting, and soon the final revelations would align perfectly. Yet even as she observed, a sense of anticipation lingered. There was one final element missing, a confrontation or disclosure that would bind these clues into the full narrative. Miss Marple, with her customary patience, knew that the moment was approaching. And when it came, the quiet village of St. Mary Mead would bear witness to a resolution both surprising and inevitable, crafted by the careful interplay of observation, wit, and gentle persistence. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Clara Henshaw's sitting room, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the golden light. The warmth of the fire filled the space, but the atmosphere carried a gentle tension, the kind that heralds the revelation of long-held secrets. Miss Marple sat quietly across from the widow, her knitting set aside, eyes attentive yet patient, allowing Clara to speak in her own time. There was a silence that invited trust, and Clara's fingers nervously traced the edge of her teacup as if steadying herself for what was to come. After a long pause, Clara's voice broke the stillness. "Miss Marple, I suppose it is time someone knew the truth. About my dances, about everything." Her gaze fell to the floor, a mixture of shame and resolve in her expression. Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes encouraging yet gentle, a silent invitation to continue. Clara took a deep breath and began. She explained the complicated web of family obligations, secret debts, and clandestine arrangements that had followed the Henshaw estate for decades. The metal box, she revealed, contained documents that ensured the family's remaining wealth was protected, the letters offering instructions to be followed discreetly to prevent scandal or legal complications. Her nocturnal visits to the churchyard were not whimsical. They were acts of careful management, checking the placement of the box and ensuring nothing was disturbed. "The dances," she admitted softly, "were meant as a signal. To myself, and perhaps to anyone observing, that I was aware that I had control." There was a faint tremor in her voice, betraying both the stress of secrecy and the subtle thrill of reclaiming agency over a complicated situation. Miss Marple nodded knowingly. She had observed the same meticulous caution in every gesture, every glance, and now Clara's words confirmed what the observant mind had suspected. The conversation continued, touching upon the stranger's brief visit, the letter that arrived unexpectedly, and the village gossip that had swirled relentlessly. Each incident, Clara explained, fit into a careful plan, a network of small actions meant to preserve privacy and protect the family's dignity. The widow's courage, her discretion, and her quiet resolve shone through her words, transforming what had seemed eccentric into an admirable display of intelligence and prudence. Miss Marple asked gentle questions, prompting Clara to clarify small details, the sequence of visits to the grave, the significance of the documents, the timing of messages left and retrieved. Each answer solidified the emerging picture, a woman navigating a maze of secrecy with wisdom, patience, and strategic foresight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft amber glow, Clara finally allowed herself a small, relieved smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "It feels lighter, speaking it aloud to someone who understands." Miss Marple returned the smile, her mind cataloguing each revelation, the threads now nearly complete. Outside, the village remained unaware that the truth had begun to surface. Inside, however, a quiet resolution had taken root, setting the stage for the final, inevitable clarifications that would bind together the curious tale of the widow who danced on her husband's grave. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke under a soft veil of mist, the village bathed in the muted glow of autumn sunlight. Birds called faintly from the hedgerows, and the distant toll of the church bell marked the beginning of another ordinary day. Yet for Miss Marple, the ordinary had been replaced with quiet triumph. The intricate web of clues, the widow's midnight dances, the secret letter, the disturbed churchyard, and the hidden metal box had all come together, forming a coherent picture that was both satisfying and quietly surprising. Miss Marple walked slowly through the village lanes, knitting bag at her side, observing the residents as they began their daily routines. Conversations were tentative, whispers careful, as if the village itself sensed the resolution was near. She paused near the Henshaw cottage, noting the widow at her doorstep, tending to a small pot of chrysanthemums. Clara's expression was calm, composed, yet there was a hint of lightness in her eyes. The burden of secrecy lifted at last. The inspector arrived shortly thereafter, his demeanour professional yet tinged with relief. Miss Marple approached him with the quiet authority of one accustomed to understanding mysteries in ways the official often overlooked. "Inspector Craddock," she said gently, "I believe the story has unravelled itself quite clearly." She proceeded to summarize the events, the family's hidden arrangements, the midnight visits, and the carefully orchestrated signals designed to protect the widow's privacy while managing the estate's affairs. Each piece of the puzzle fit seamlessly, a tapestry woven with subtlety and intelligence. Craddock listened attentively, nodding in understanding as Miss Marple explained the significance of the metal box, the letter, and the clues left in the churchyard. "Remarkable," he said finally. "All the chaos, and yet everything accounted for." Miss Marple smiled, allowing him the satisfaction of a formal acknowledgment while knowing that the finer details, motives, subtleties, and the widow's clever ingenuity were best appreciated by the patient observer. Clara stepped forward, offering a quiet, measured explanation to the inspector. Her account confirmed Miss Marple's observations. The midnight dances were symbolic, the disturbances at the churchyard purposeful, and the secrecy maintained not out of malice, but out of prudence. The village's curiosity, though initially a source of scandal, had inadvertently aided the careful management of information, allowing the widow to act with discretion and wisdom. By afternoon, the tension in St. Mary Mead had dissolved, replaced by a calm appreciation for the complexity of human behaviour. Villagers returned to their routines, their imaginations still buzzing, but now with a sense of relief that the mystery was solved without scandal or harm. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the vicarage gate, reflected on the elegance of subtle observation. In the quiet of the village, patience, attention to detail, and an understanding of human nature had revealed the truth with the gentle certainty she had always trusted. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the cobblestones, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The puzzle was solved, yet the village continued to hum with the quiet intrigue of daily life, proof, if ever it were needed, that even in the calmest settings, curiosity and secrets walk hand in hand. Chapter 6. Fireside Closure. By late afternoon, the news of the resolution had begun to ripple gently through St. Mary Mead. Word spread, not in the rush of alarm, but in the soft, deliberate cadence of village conversation, as neighbours discussed the widow's midnight dances, the hidden box, and the intricacies of her family's affairs. The air was thick with curiosity, speculation, and admiration, as the villagers came to understand the careful planning and discretion that had guided Clara Henshaw's actions. Miss Marple walked slowly along the high street, observing these reactions with quiet amusement. Mrs. Pettigrew chattered excitedly to anyone who would listen, recounting every detail she had heard, embellishing slightly, yet always returning to a tone of awe. "Who would have thought," she said breathlessly, "that such cleverness lay behind those eerie nights in the churchyard?" Miss Marple smiled, noting how even exaggeration could highlight the brilliance of subtle deeds. Meanwhile, the vicar conversed gently with parishioners who were still unsettled by the recent events. His calm explanations helped temper fears while offering reassurance that no scandal, danger, or wrongdoing had taken place. Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, recognized the delicate interplay of rumor and relief. The village needed to process the story, and in doing so, they began to see the widow not as eccentric or unsettling, but as resourceful and prudent. Even Inspector Craddock's presence contributed to the shifting atmosphere. He spoke to select villagers with measured detail, explaining the resolution without diminishing the cleverness of the widow's actions or Miss Marple's perceptive observations. His acknowledgment of Miss Marple's subtle guidance carried quiet weight, signaling that insight and patience were as crucial to solving mysteries as formal investigation. Clara Henshaw, at last, could step into the light without fear or judgment. She moved gracefully through her garden, nodding politely to neighbors, answering inquiries with calm composure, and even allowing a faint smile to cross her lips when thanked for her prudence. The village's perception shifted gradually. Curiosity and gossip softened into admiration and respect. The widow, who had once seemed strange, even audacious, became a figure of clever dignity, a quiet reminder that appearances could be deceptive and that careful planning often masked great intelligence. Miss Marple noted one particularly amusing detail. Children playing near the churchyard paused to recount the story, wide-eyed, their imagination filled with spectres and dancing shadows. Yet even in their fanciful interpretation, the essence of the mystery, the careful orchestration of events, the subtle clues, the thoughtful resolution, remained intact. As the day drew to a close, the village exhaled collectively. The unusual events that had stirred anxiety and curiosity were now woven into the fabric of St. Mary Mead's communal memory. Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the vicarage gate, reflected on the gentle satisfaction of seeing a mystery resolved without harm, scandal, or unnecessary fear. In her heart, she knew the village was safer, wiser, and perhaps just a little more enchanted by the quiet brilliance of human ingenuity. And so, as twilight settled, St. Mary Mead returned to its usual rhythms, the echoes of curiosity and discovery lingering like a soft, comforting whisper. The evening descended upon St. Mary Mead like a soft, familiar blanket. The village, having processed the curious events of the past days, settled into a gentle calm. Windows glowed warmly with lamplight, chimneys breathed out thin ribbons of smoke, and the faint scent of wood smoke and baked bread mingled in the cool autumn air. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair beside the fire, the flames crackling and dancing, mirroring the quiet satisfaction in her mind. Her knitting needles clicked softly, the rhythm comforting, the world outside hushed and content. Across the hearth, a tray of tea and freshly baked scones awaited, a small indulgence in the routine of evening, yet rich in the warmth of domesticity. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to reflect on the events that had unfolded. The widow's midnight dances, the secret letters, the disturbed gravestones, and the mysterious box had all come together, revealing a tale of prudence, courage, and cleverness. The delicate balance of St. Mary Mead had been preserved, and the village's curiosity had transformed into admiration. The firelight cast a golden glow on the walls, illuminating shelves lined with books, knitting supplies, and the small trinkets of a life steeped in observation and quiet curiosity. Miss Marple's eyes, twinkling behind her spectacles, traced the familiar patterns of comfort and calm around her. Each detail of the room, the well-worn armchair, the flickering shadows, the gentle aroma of tea, reminded her that even amid intrigue, life retained its simple pleasures. Her thoughts turned briefly to the widow, Clara Henshaw. The village now regarded her with respect, curiosity having softened into admiration. The careful planning, courage, and ingenuity of her nocturnal actions had not only resolved the hidden complications of her late husband's estate, but had also preserved the dignity of all involved. Miss Marple smiled quietly. It was always a delicate joy to see order, justice, and understanding restored in subtle, human ways. Outside, the village lay serene, the streets empty but for the occasional flicker of lamplight or the shadow of a late passerby. Inside, the fire's warmth spread across the room, and Miss Marple lifted her teacup in a quiet toast to the calm, the cleverness, and the subtle triumphs that marked another chapter in St. Mary Mead's quietly extraordinary life. And now, dear listener, I am most grateful that you stayed with me through every twist, every quiet discovery, and every little secret revealed in this tale. Do share your thoughts and favorite moments in the comments. It is always a pleasure to hear from fellow sleuths. If you enjoyed this cozy journey, a like is a gentle way to show your support, and subscribing will ensure that the next gentle mystery in St. Mary Mead finds its way to you, warm by the fire, just as soon as it is ready.